Hi friends, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Here's what we're discussing today. It's said that a person who represents himself in court has a fool for a client. And of course, we all remember double-barreled Darrell Brooks and his ridiculous hijinks at trial. But now, ongoing is a case that really calls out for an experienced defense attorney, and unfortunately, we have a pro se defender. And it's really a shame because the guy might very well be factually innocent. I'll explain a little bit more in just a second. So, when I heard that this Florida versus Tucker case involved Tucker functioning as his own attorney, I couldn't believe that we were going to have to go through this again. But it's a little different, and I'm actually kind of impressed with the mannerisms, anyway, of this fellow. He was living in an abandoned warehouse at the time of this murder back in 2017. And now he sort of looks like a, CEO from a Fortune 500 company when he's presenting stuff in court. So the flashbacks to Brooks, those are gone. I wondered, when I first thought about that, if we'd see a box for it or see him scowl at the judge and all that kind of stuff. But when I started to investigate the case, what I found is some truly amazing stuff. Now, many of you probably don't realize, but before I start doing any of these cases, I always try to go to the local news media and sort of get the backstory on what happened, when it happened, where it happened, all that stuff. Because while you get a lot of that information in the opening statement, you don't nearly get enough of it. Now, in the recitation that I do here of these facts, I'm going to trivialize certain things, mostly because I find some humor in the way the state will be handling this case, but it isn't because I want to make fun of the victims. I want to make fun of the criminals, right? I'm not making fun of the victims, and one of the victims here may very well be Ty Tucker. So we'll get to that here in just a moment. But when I make light of things, it isn't intended to be disrespectful to the victims. It is intended to be disrespectful to people who do bad things to good people. I try very hard not to be like all those other YouTubers who open up every video by asking you to subscribe before you've even seen the content. But now that you've gone a few minutes into the content, if you find this interesting and helpful, please subscribe. I'd consider it a personal favor. So here's the backstory. On November 17th, 2017, two masked men attacked 53-year-old Paula Belmonte. Now, Paula Belmonte, according to local media again, is alleged to be a drug dealer. And in fact, they found marked buy money at the murder scene. She's attacked by two people who are wearing masks. And they go to her place. She's living on the top or on the roof of a guy's house by the name of Matthew Bonnet. And Bonnet owns this thing called the Tree House. It's on Stock Island in Monroe County, down in the Keys, South Florida. So our two masked robbers, they want money. They put a knife to her throat and demand money from Paula. And Paula screamed at the top of her lungs, which, I'm pretty sure that many people would do that. But star note, this is one of those things that while I can understand it, I also think it's not a good idea, because if somebody has a really sharp knife at your throat, it does tend to be a little off-putting when you shriek into their ear. So the fellow with the knife must have thought that, she had something wrong with her vocal cords, so he decided to do a little surgery on her neck without anesthesia. Yeah, he cut a 7-inch gash in her throat. Now, remember the guy who owned the treehouse, Bonnet, Matthew Bonnet? Well, he heard the scream and he rushed upstairs to help the woman. Now, I suppose he might have thought that she'd fallen or that she'd seen something like a mouse or, a big snake or something like that. But he didn't go up there prepared to deal with two people who were armed with knives. Here's the thing, however. When someone is engaged in radical neck surgery without anesthesia, generally speaking, they don't want an audience, and perhaps more importantly, they still want the money. So when Bennett got to the roof and saw what was happening, he realized he had left his weapons in his other pants, and he did a quick about face and tried desperately to get out of there. But our two aspiring surgeons knew how to get their point across, and they stopped their surgical procedure on Ms. Belmonte and instead went after Bonnet, stabbing him multiple times from behind as he tried to run away. Belmonte survived the attempted thyroidectomy that they were doing, but Bonnet bled out and was dead by the time the cops got there. According to state prosecutors, Franklin Tyrone Tucker, who goes by the diminutive Ty, is one of the two people who was a treehouse murderer. But there's a problem with that, and we'll get to that in just a moment here. Did you notice this started in 2017? Yeah, about that. It turns out that Rory Wilson, who shared space with Ty in this abandoned warehouse, took responsibility for the murder and said that he did it. And the state says a witness named April Walker saw Tucker get rid of his bloody clothes the night of the murder, and after his arrest, Tucker allegedly confessed to his cellmate, Naeem Jackson. Now, you got to take a little bit of that with a grain of salt. Anybody who's been around criminal courts very long knows that there are 101 snitches in every jail, and they all have something they want to sell. And if it means selling somebody else down the river for a life sentence, that's not their problem. Their problem is getting out of jail. So, you have to take this confession thing, a little bit, with a little bit of a grain of salt. So Jackson said that Tucker admitted to him having stabbed this 59-year-old Bonnet. He was shocked, he said, by Tucker's apparent lack of remorse and spontaneously reported the confession to the sheriff's deputies. Well, what an upstanding citizen, even if he was in jail. So Tucker is facing life in prison, and you've just heard the prosecutor's official story. But is it the real story? Because there is a different narrative, and it deals with a badly handled police investigation. Now, opening statement is about discussing what the evidence will be and where the case is heading. It's a preview, if you will. Let's watch the opening statement on behalf of the state. It's fairly short, actually, and it doesn't provide a whole heck of a lot of information.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good morning. My name is Assistant State Attorney David Alvarez, and along with my colleague, Chief Assistant State Attorney Joseph Mansfield, will be conducting the presentation of the evidence on behalf of the state this morning and throughout the course of the trial. I'd like to start off by saying thank you for your participation in this process. It's very important, not only to the state, but to Mr. Tucker as well. So we thank you. And as the judge has already told you, the defendant is charged with a series of crimes. I'm not going to go over them again. We believe the evidence in this case will show that on or about November 17th of 2017, at 5650 Laurel Avenue, Stock Island, Florida, a place commonly known as the Treehouse, the defendant in this case, Mr. Franklin Tyrone Tucker, along with co-defendants Rory Wilson and Travis Johnson, planned and effectuated a robbery at that location, which at the time was the residence of Paula Belmonte. On said date, at approximately 7:45 or a little bit before there, these three individuals, and you'll hear testimony of this, the evidence will show this, that they actually spoke about how they were going to effectuate and pull off this robbery. They drove past the treehouse once just to stake it out, came back. Defendants Wilson and Tucker put on their dark clothing and grabbed their weapons and their mask, and then got back into Mr. Travis Johnson's truck and drove to the treehouse. The plan was, as you'll hear and the evidence will show, that Mr. Tucker and Mr. Wilson were going to go up the treehouse, and the reason it's referred to as a treehouse, it's a series of stairs that leads. I don't want to describe it as an apartment, but it's a place where people could sleep. It had tarps over it. It really didn't even have roofs. And I believe the victims in the case, Miss Belmonte and Mr. Raggett, will explain that in detail, as well as some of the deputies that you'll hear from. But in the commission of committing this robbery, defendants Tucker, this actual defendant, Mr. Tucker and Mr. Wilson, went up into the treehouse and held Miss Belmonte and Mr. Raggett at knife point. Miss Belmonte was held at knife point with a knife to her throat. During the commission of this robbery, her throat was slashed, and you will see pictures of her injuries during the course of this case. The state is going to be introducing photos of that. Mr. Raggett was also held at knife point. He was beaten, punched several times. He'll actually testify that he was knocked back into a tarp. At this time of the year, I believe in November, it wasn't quite fully dark yet. It was dusk, the sun was setting, but they were able to discern that the alleged perpetrators were coming up the stairs, and eventually what happened. In the process of committing this alleged crime, obviously in fear of their lives, Miss Belmonte and Mr. Raggett were screaming in fear for their lives, and unfortunately the crimes didn't stop there. A neighbor, Mr. Matthew Bonnet, heard the screams and decided to render aid, or at least try to assist in somehow. As he was coming up the stairs, the evidence will show that Mr. Tucker and Mr. Wilson confronted him. There was a struggle that ensued, and Mr. Bonnet was stabbed numerous times and eventually died from these injuries. The defendants then fled the scene. Defendant Johnson, who was waiting in his dark-colored pickup truck, a getaway driver, noticing that there was a commotion going on, decided to leave his two accomplices and drives away. They ultimately meet up at a warehouse where they were all residing together, probably about 500 or 600 feet from the actual treehouse, where an argument ensued, and Mr. Johnson decided to walk down to the Tom Tom to get some cigarettes, where he met up with Mr. Detroit Wilson, Mr. Rory Wilson. You're going to hear from numerous witnesses during the state's presentation, and shall be presented with numerous exhibits of evidence for your review and consideration in this case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state is absolutely confident that at the conclusion of this matter, you will find that the defendant, Franklin Tyrone Tucker, is guilty as charged in the indictment and the amended information. Thank you.
So after the state does their opening statement, Tucker gets up and starts to do his opening statement. And I thought he had a couple of really good lines, but then he drifted into argument.
Okay. That was a nice presentation. I'd say, by the way, good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. That was quite the story. But the problem is nothing in that story tells you what evidence they have, what evidence they're going to show. You know, how are they going to actually tie me into that story? Anyway, you know, the prosecution, you know, tells that story, but the problem is very little of that story is true. That's the bottom line. And, you know, yes, about the only thing that was true in that story is, yes, John Travis Johnson was there. That's a fact, right? This state witness, you know, they keep on saying he's the getaway driver, right? Out of all the evidence...
Object argumentative.
Yeah, I'm going to sustain the objection.
Is it my
Again,
turn?
this is an opportunity to talk about what the evidence you expect will show.
that's where I'm going, Your Honor.
Okay.
Just give me a second, I'll get right there. I was actually just getting to that point. Out of all the evidence they show, all the witnesses they bring, Where are they going to show he's the getaway driver? That's what you need to look at, right? Because the defense, we can show all day there is no evidence saying he was a getaway driver. We can also show that there's evidence that says otherwise.
Now, opening statement is about previewing the case, right? It's not about arguing the case. You basically get to preview the case. And these prosecutors, unlike some that I've talked about recently, understood that and objected immediately. So let's watch a little bit of what Tucker says the issues are in this case.
As far as the evidence we intend to put on, we're going to put on the surviving victim, Ms. Paula Belmont, who says, 100% sure it wasn't me that night. 100%. Now, just as Mr. Alvarez said, this is a woman who was brutally beaten, robbed, had her throat slit, literally sat there and watched her friend get murdered viciously. But yet she is testifying on my side. Now, don't get me wrong, what motivation could she have? Anyway, going down the line here, we're also intent on going ahead and, calling a few other witnesses here. The next one after that is probably going to be Mrs. Angela Oslowski. Again, talking about evidence, right? Well, this is the woman who did the FDLE reports, the forensic evidence that that they submitted, right? All the evidence comes back. None of my DNA, none of my my blood, none of my fingerprints, none of that stuff. Okay, so no forensic evidence, right? Okay, surviving victim says it wasn't me. Okay, so we'll go on down from there. The next one, Mr. Tom Walker from Internal Affairs, right? Now, Mr. Tom Walker goes ahead and investigates the investigation because of a complaint I made, right? A complaint that comes back sustained, right? Comes back as sustained for an investigation that was so poor, so poorly executed. 208 pieces of evidence were found to be mishandled by the MCSO.
So it sounds, anyway, that the state might have a few problems with this case, but that doesn't even scratch the surface. So then later, in cross-examination, which is more art than science, he drew 30 objections over the course of this long cross-examination of several of the deputies, and 25 of those were sustained. And I think a lot of those, if he had had any opportunity to study cross-examination, he could have figured out how to get a lot of this stuff in. And I'm not going to go through it here because it would just make the video way too long. But here's something I want you to think about. Because you're hearing that, they had all these objections sustained against him, and you're probably thinking, well, this is a Darrell Brooks redux, right? But it isn't. A lack of experience doesn't mean a lack of intellect. And perhaps more importantly, if you're sitting in that jury box, what would you be thinking if, when this guy is asking questions of the detectives in the case, the state keeps popping up like a jack-in-the-box, objecting to every question? Might you think the state had something to hide? Well, apparently they do. For example, remember that fellow who was so outraged that Tucker didn't feel remorseful that he blurted out that confession to the cops because he's just such a good guy? Yeah, well, about that. You see, the one victim who survived, Paula Belmonte, says Tucker wasn't there. And Wilson says he did it. Given that, how do you tie Tucker to the crime? Well, you need somebody like Naeem Jackson. Now, the alleged confession of Tucker to his cellmate occurred at a rather serendipitous moment. At that time, all the victims had denied that Tucker was involved, and the coroner's report had come back leading to the conclusion that the murderer was likely left-handed. Now, Rory Wilson is left-handed, while Tucker is right-handed. Now, I want you to think about this. You've got a couple of people who are trying to attack Paula Belmonte. and one of them has gashed her throat. So certainly, as to her, there is already some blood in the water. And then up comes Matthew Bonnet, and he wants to put a stop to this, realizes that he doesn't have the ability to do that given the two big knives these guys had, and turns around. Now, what you have to believe is that, according to Naeem Jackson, Tucker had confessed to murdering Bonnet and supposedly had the presence of mind in the middle of a knife fight, and he's right-handed, and he's like, uh-oh, I'm going to have to push this off on my buddy here, Rory Wilson, who's probably going to admit that he did it anyway, and I'm going to switch my knife to my left hand so that I can set him up. But of course, at the time, Jackson didn't know that Rory Wilson was going to admit to having been there and done that. So, again, Wilson says he did it, but according to the supposed confession, he switched to his left hand so that he could frame Rory Wilson. Now, here's the interesting part. The state prosecutor told the judge in this that Jackson didn't have anything to gain as the witness. But then the defense team started investigating, and they started investigating the movements of inmates at the county jail. So the jails always maintain records, and if somebody is in a particular cell block, and a lot of these are sort of dormitory-like cell blocks, they're locked in a cell with one person at night, but then they open the cells during the day, and that's where they mill around, watch TV, play cards, plan their next series of crimes, whatever it is people do in jail. And according to the local media, they found that the detectives had Jackson moved next to Wilson. And then, after he moved next to Wilson, he was made to bunk next to Tucker. And the defense also discovered that Jackson had been a professional confidential informant since 2011, and that contrary to what he'd been told to the judge, Jackson was under a contract as a confidential informant with the sheriff's office at the time he supposedly heard this confession. And in a recorded interview at the jail, one of the detectives asked him, "What's your end game here?" And Jackson says, "Of course I want something. I want the charges dropped so I can go back home on probation." And you know, the case was reassigned to Colleen Dunn, who's prosecuting Tucker, and I'm sure it is absolute coincidence that it was simply dismissed after that. So maybe, just maybe, there is something to this whole botched investigation angle. So as we go through this case, it'll be interesting to see how this all stacks up. I want to thank you for getting this far with me. If you have an opportunity, please go out of your way today and do something nice for someone. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't like. If this is an interesting case, let me know. If you've heard about this case and you know something I don't know that might change my opinion, please put it in the comments. Thanks again for listening, and catch me down here at the beach again next time. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.